Chicago, February 14th, 1929. The police found 7 bodies riddled with bullets in a garage. Gangsters, victims of gang rivalry. These murders were instantly front-page news. They were a brutal reminder of the violence that had been raging in the United States since the early 20s. The alleged perpetrator of this gangland slaying was Al Capone, the flamboyant gangster who became a living legend, the dark side of the American dream.
Carrière de gangster. 10 jours après la découverte du corps du petit gars provoqué ce nouveau un véritable séisme en Belgique.
In Prohibition-era America, an all-out gang war wreaked havoc in its big cities. But it was a bonanza for the booming newspaper industry. Crime sells.
It was like a daily serial. Folks on their farms or in their modest apartments lapped up these tales of gangsters and cops. What's more, every so often they'd get to see a restaurant blown up, a liquor truck attacked, or a car chase with guns blazing. And the papers were full of mobsters. There were more than enough.
The gangland violence was much splashier, much more loud and spectacular in Chicago than elsewhere. In some other cities, if 3 men are killed, it's a massacre, there's outrage. In Chicago, it took 7 men to be killed before there was gigantic outrage.
With the carnage that took place on February 14th, 1929 in a Chicago garage, gangland violence reached new heights. Arriving hot on the heels of the police, journalists described a horrific scene. The victims were lying in pools of blood, literally ripped apart by the barrage of bullets.
There was very, very heavy coverage by the Chicago newspapers of this event. It was a massive, massive news event. Very quickly started to use the word massacre for the first time. I believe one of the crime writers wrote something like, Chicago gangland has graduated from murder to massacre, as a short description of the St. Valentine's Day event.
This massacre provoked a huge public outcry. And it was, above all, the press who associated the name of this day, usually devoted to love, with a massacre, specifically to make an even stronger impression on their readers.
The fierce competition between Chicago's 4 dailies led to a game of one-upmanship. With the press's exploitation of the St. Valentine's Day massacre, ethics went out the window.
If there had been some taboo or some implicit sort of boundary, we do not show, the bodies in gangland killings, somebody decided, well, now is the time to break that because the public, despite the taboo, is going to want to see these photos and we can sell a lot of newspapers.
The photos of the St. Valentine's Day massacre in the press had a significant impact because they showed the corpses. They showed the victims' faces. This was a first in the American press. It usually concealed dead bodies by placing an X over them.
The newspapers ran those photos showing the bodies. It certainly caused quite a bit of shock and outrage. With the St. Valentine's Day massacre, that moved up to a whole new level about, look at what our city has become. My God, what is going on here?
Crime and crime news stories were at the heart of this new journalism industry that emerged in the United States in the late 19th century. For this new journalism, specializing in fast information, scoops, sensational, hard-hitting revelations, crime really became its stock in trade.
It was a popular press. The papers were extremely cheap, so even the working class could afford them. A section of this press, which emerged in the early 20th century, was dubbed the muckraker press. Muckrakers were journalists who dug around in the muck to expose and decry the growing hardships and inequities in America's big cities.
It was really a time when this form of journalism, not only for purely commercial reasons, crime sold papers, but also at times for more political and moral reasons, focused much of its attention on crime as a symptom of an American disease created by the modern city, industry, and American society.
Magnified in the media, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre brutally highlighted this development. The papers reported each step of the investigation, such as the police's reconstruction of the massacre. Readers learned the victims were Irish, members of the notorious North Side Gang. They were lined up against a wall by fake policemen, supposedly for a routine check, and mowed down by an avalanche of bullets. Shot 22 times, Frank Gusenberg was still alive but refused to cooperate. Before dying, he simply said, "Nobody shot me." The gang's leader, Bugs Moran, who miraculously avoided the ambush, accused his arch-rival in the press. Only Al Capone kills like that. But the Italian mobster had a cast-iron alibi. At the time of the massacre, he was thousands of miles away in his luxurious Florida mansion.
It was impossible to prove Al Capone's direct involvement because the investigation did not lead straight to him. But everyone knew the massacre had been ordered and planned by Al Capone.
Criminals do not and cannot settle their differences legally. They cannot go to court to settle differences. They settle them through violence, and then there was incredible violence because of gangland conflicts.
The St. Valentine's Day Massacre marked a turning point in the gang war that had raged for years in Chicago. The gangsters were battling for control of the lucrative liquor trade, a direct consequence of Prohibition, a nationwide ban on the production and sale of alcohol. It had been introduced in 1920 thanks to the intense lobbying of the country's temperance leagues, supported by the most conservative section of its population.
The reason why Prohibition came to be introduced nationwide was the perception that the consumption of alcohol was associated with the Irish Americans, the Italian Americans, the German Americans, recent immigrants who, according to the older settlers, did not really fit into American society. And the anxiety caused by the increasingly massive immigration of new settlers at the turn of the 20th century helped to legitimize Prohibition.
The United States had just passed major immigration laws, such as the Emergency Quota Act, to restrict the flow of immigrants into the country. So there was a retreat into deeply embedded values, and at the same time, it was a society that had entered an age of huge industrial growth, which saw America's first consumer boom. It was the great age of the automobile, for instance, with the Model T Ford, the first car ordinary Americans could afford. It was a period of great prosperity, which opened up the country to the rest of the world, and at the same time, paradoxically, you had this retreat into a certain number of values, of which Prohibition was the symptom.
It was a totally absurd law, probably the most absurd ever voted in the United States. Besides, it was a law desired by the Puritans, devout churchgoers and mothers, who hit the streets at the time demanding a ban on alcohol. And it was a law that banned alcohol in one of the world's heaviest drinking countries. All of a sudden, they were told, that's it, drinking's a crime now.
Prohibition created all sorts of problems. One of these problems arose from the fact that it divided American society into two groups. On one side, you had the wets, who were in favor of keeping alcohol available, and on the other, the dries, who were Protestant and puritanical, whereas the wets tended to be Catholic.
This culture clash between the wets and the dries occurred during an exuberant era. In the 1920s, which became known as the Roaring Twenties, America experienced an explosion of culture and a major boom in its entertainment industry. Instead of curbing creativity, Prohibition positively stimulated it. In the city's speakeasies, or illicit drinking dens, a new social, racial, and cultural mix emerged. And a genre of music that went on to conquer the world flourished in this environment: jazz.
The whole thing backfired. People who would usually have sworn, hand on their heart, to never break the law, began happily transgressing it. Polite society gathered in cafes, where there was all sorts of great entertainment. Everyone drank tea or coffee. Either you were served bourbon in it, or you had a hip flask hidden up your skirt or in your pocket. It was great fun. For polite society, Prohibition was actually far more fun than having alcohol freely available.
For the promoters of Prohibition, the desire had been to raise the morality of the American public. And they were greatly disappointed because they saw that, instead of moralizing the American way of life, it had actually weakened the prestige of the law. As a great many Americans thought they didn't have to respect a law they regarded as illegitimate.
Above all, Prohibition represented a fabulous business opportunity for organized crime. Already involved in prostitution, gambling, and extortion, the gangs got their hands on a very lucrative and now illegal market: the production, import, and sale of beer and whiskey.
It helped transform the American mob, which, in a sense, perfected its organization, industrialized its business, and expanded its activities beyond neighborhoods to entire cities, and then even became nationwide in its scope.
The underworld's rapid expansion was also facilitated by the collusion of the authorities. Many police officers were hostile to the law and not overzealous in enforcing it, while the politicians preferred to handle the gangsters carefully because of their valuable support during electoral campaigns. An endemic disease in the United States, corruption was now widespread.
The speakeasies were extremely visible. Everyone knew where they were, from the citizens, the individual citizens, to the police and the authorities. So to operate, they had to have been paying bribes so that people looked the other way. And who are they paying off? The police and the politicians locally, as well as the federal prohibition agents in many cases, barring an occasional show raid where the speakeasy was called ahead of time by the police and told, okay, we're getting a lot of complaints, so look, we do have to come in. We're coming in Thursday at 5 o'clock, and we're going to raid your speakeasy. Just, we'll give you 2 days' notice, and then the speakeasy would, of course, make sure the owner wasn't there and there wasn't so much liquor there, and they would go along with the raid. So the police had a raid to show, to the newspapers or something. There was a variety of hypocrisy, but what was the most important for how the bootlegging worked was that many senior police officers and politicians became quite rich during Prohibition.
No politician at that time could have risen through the ranks and become what they became, a minister, the president, or whatever, without the support of the mob, and therefore, without corruption. Everyone was corrupt.
And as time went on, it was becoming more and more unpopular, as more and more people who might have originally have been for it were seeing that it really was not working. More and more people were becoming convinced that it was really a failure compared to what its intended objectives were, by and large.
It was in Chicago, the second largest city in the United States, that this failure was most evident. The city had clearly sided with wets and pointedly refused to enforce the law. There were no fewer than 20,000 speakeasies there.
Chicago was a hard-drinking town in terms of the many of its residents, many of them being first generation or second generation who grew up with liquor at the dinner table and liquor as part of celebrations and when more than one or two people got together.
Chicago had everything going for it. It's on the edge of the Great Lakes, a vast inland sea, and close to the Canadian border. So absolutely ideal conditions for transporting liquor very easily. Plus, the folks who had come up with the idea of Prohibition hadn't thought of ways to combat people who violated it. It was easy. The border was porous.
Chicago, scene of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, was America's capital of crime. This label wasn't new, though. The city had cultivated a tradition of lawlessness since the late 19th century. A defining feature, largely the result of its spectacular growth.
Chicago was the great city of industry, an ultra-modern metropolis with a vast number of skyscrapers where car ownership boomed throughout the 20s. It was a big city that attracted immigrants from all over Europe, as well as a large portion of the free black population who came looking for work in the city's factories. All of this created a fertile ground for crime, which grew like the poisonous flower of the modern American city.
Chicago was home to the first academic study on the causes of crime. A former journalist, Robert Park, was the father of this new type of sociology known as the Chicago School, which explored the relationships between urban space and crime by studying them on the ground, in the very heart of the city's seediest neighborhoods.
Il degrado. The
decay and poverty of the ethnic slums tended to magnify the role of those who found their way out of this destitution. And so the crime bosses, or kingpins, became models of success.
Al Capone was one of these. The son of Neapolitan immigrants, he enjoyed a meteoric rise, making his mark through violence and corruption. Nicknamed Scarface, he was one of Chicago's most powerful gangsters by age 30. Head of an organization of several hundred men, Capone had a considerable fortune and flaunted his criminal success with his flashy, flamboyant style.
Al Capone rapidly established himself as a boss thanks to his brutality. He was extremely paranoid, and if he ever suspected someone of betrayal, he'd cut off their head or butcher them.
When one rises up from being just a low-level gangster involved in violence, doing what you're told, to moving up and being in charge of things, one is business ability. And it's clear that Capone had that.
Capone was a complex individual, a colorful, flamboyant gangster who courted the press, public opinion, and liked to be seen in the newspapers.
Organized crime figures in the U.S. traditionally, they tend to keep a very low profile. They try and stay as much as possible out of the public eye. Al Capone was unusual in the sense, for a major gang boss especially, that he freely gave newspaper interviews, freely talked to the press.
He was a celebrity. When his limousine drove by in the streets of Chicago, people would stop and wave. He cultivated the image of a flamboyant gangster to whom nothing could happen, precisely because he was such a popular and public figure. He was not a positive hero in the moral sense, but someone who was a very appealing figure to the American public.
But with the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, Al Capone's popularity plummeted. In the press, the likable mobster gave way to a cruel and hateful figure. Public enemy number one.
It was definitely one of Al Capone's few big mistakes. No one ever forgave him.
To win back the public's favor, Al Capone engaged in charitable works. The Wall Street crash of October 1929 had plunged the United States into economic depression. The mobster opened a soup kitchen, providing 3 square meals a day to hundreds of unemployed workers. He was back in the limelight, but a newcomer was about to steal Al Capone's thunder for good.
A group of important Chicago citizens went to see the President Hoover in Washington, D.C. in, I believe, March 1929. They were able to get a meeting with him and said, look, we have a serious problem here, and the local authorities can't or won't seemingly do anything about this man, Capone. Can the federal government help us?
The federal government's answer was Eliot Ness, a 26-year-old police officer and leader of a new law enforcement squad specifically created to bring down Al Capone. These 10 hand-picked agents, nicknamed the Untouchables, became America's new heroes.
And that squad is actually formed to go and attack now the Capone gang's source of income from alcohol, to attack Capone breweries, to attack Capone distilleries. If you can cripple them financially, then you can cripple the gang.
Like Al Capone, Eliot Ness used the press to publicize his tactics and garner public support. He invited reporters to the Untouchables' raids on Al Capone's breweries. Although the squad seriously damaged the gangster's operation, they had nothing to charge him with.
Al Capone had always been protected by frontmen, so he was never directly involved in financial transactions. It was impossible to pin anything on him. No one had succeeded apart from once, in 1929, when he was arrested on a minor gun possession charge, but he did less than a year behind bars.
An idea emerged that can be summed up simply. If you want to bring down a criminal, what do? You follow the money, and that's what they did.
While Eliot Ness and his squad kept the pressure up on the ground, federal tax agents looked for a trace of Al Capone in the organization's accounts. After 2 years investigating, they finally found it. Al Capone was arrested for tax evasion, tried in October 1931, and sentenced to 11 years in prison.
He got busted for something pretty dumb. He was guilty of God knows how many crimes and murders, but he was convicted for not paying his taxes. The press helped put Capone on a pedestal, reported his many escapades, and gave column space to those who opposed him. It acted as a repository and a voice, that's for sure. The press made Capone, the press broke Capone.
Al Capone disappeared behind the bars of Alcatraz. Prohibition ended in 1933, but it had caused irreversible damage. American organized crime had made a killing. It reinvested in new forms of trafficking, such as drugs, and continued to thrive, only more discreetly. As for the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, it became legendary.
Not since Scarface, so much action.
The first gangster movies done by the major Hollywood studios, those come out around 1929, 1930 or so, and it's no accident that many of them are set in Chicago. None of the characters are named Al Capone, but there's one named Scarface, and there's other ones that have names very similar to some of the Chicago gangsters. And it does create this image of the gangster then, that then has stayed with us, over the years. You can go anywhere on this earth probably, and people will know, if you say Al Capone, they have an idea who you're talking about, American gangster. Dressed somewhat loud with the big pinstripes and the Mussolino, obviously violent, things like that. He has crossed the line from being a historical figure to being a legend.
What's more, Capone goes with his antithesis, Eliot Ness. The two go together, the hero and the anti-hero. The gangster movie genre sustained some of the momentum created by Capone and the mobsters of the 20s.
Ambivalent hero, emancipated, nonconformist, tragic yet free. The gangster has a seemingly indestructible appeal.
The gangster definitely represents the dark side, with which part of the population identifies, especially men. The gangster is a criminal, but also a man of honor. The masculine model of the gangster is very much associated with honor. It's also associated with sexuality, because gangsters evidently have a very intense, very explosive sex life, which is a sign of real manliness too.
Why are we fascinated about gangsters and more generally about crime? To borrow a phrase from the Star Wars movie, this is the dark side, because we spend all of our day on the non-dark side. So the other side, the unknown, the life we don't live is very, very fascinating to us.
What I find interesting as a novelist, screenwriter, and reader, the three positions are the same, is transgression. Thank goodness for gangsters. And thank goodness they get caught.